The third wildflower was a mistake. Not because it wasn't beautiful. It was. A perfect bell-shaped thing the color of a summer dusk, its petals still holding a hint of morning dew. It was a mistake because it was the one that broke King Callum Dunbar. He didn't roar. He didn't flip a table. He did something far more terrifying. He went quiet. He stood in the doorway of their chambers, staring at the single, delicate stem Peggy was placing into a small water glass on her windowsill, and all the air in the room seemed to curdle. Peggy watched him from the corner of her eye, pretending to be absorbed in the task. 3 weeks. For 21 consecutive mornings, a gift had appeared on the outer ledge of her window. A single, perfect wildflower. A river stone so smooth it felt like solid water. The iridescent feather of a magpie. A curl of birch bark that looked like parchment. Simple, natural, anonymous things. And for 21 consecutive mornings, her mate, the alpha king of the Blackwood Conclave, the man whose roar could supposedly crack stone, had slowly, methodically, lost his mind. He is achieving a new level of internal screaming, her wolf observed from the calm, quiet center of her mind. Peggy's wolf, whose name was essentially Silence, communicated in deadpan pronouncements that were as unnerving as they were helpful. His posture suggests imminent structural collapse. Or possibly a tantrum. 50-50. "It's just a flower, Callum," Peggy said, her voice light. She turned, giving him a placid smile. Inside, she was enjoying this far more than she should. It was, objectively, the most romantic mystery she'd ever been a part of. Someone, somehow, was getting past the castle's formidable security, reaching her third-story window, and leaving her a thoughtful, silent tribute every single dawn. It was also driving her notoriously possessive mate into a state of incandescent, slow-burning fury that was, frankly, hilarious. Callum's eyes, normally the warm gold of whiskey, were dark. The skin around his jaw looked tight, and there was a restless, feral quality to his movements that she recognized. He hadn't shifted in weeks, too consumed by his investigation to run. His wolf was pressing against the surface with nowhere to go, and it was making everything worse. "It is a weed," he growled. The sound was a low vibration that made the water in the glass tremble. "A common, territory-infesting weed, and it is a declaration of war." A war against what? Sensible gardening? She picked up the previous day's gift, a flat gray stone with a perfect white line running through it, and turned it over in her palm. Her growing collection sat on a long oak shelf next to the window. 21 small, humble offerings, arranged in a neat row. Across the room, on her dressing table, sat Callum's counteroffensive. A comb carved from mother of pearl and inlaid with moonstones. A first-edition volume of poetry bound in dragon hide. A silk shawl from the eastern continent that shimmered like a captured sunset. They were magnificent, breathtaking gifts. They were also the emotional equivalent of shouting. The little stone in her hand felt like a whisper. "The human is attempting to purchase affection," Silence noted. "Our wolf, however, understands courtship is an exercise in applied observation. The Rockbringer is winning." Callum's gaze flickered to the shelf of humble treasures, and a muscle in his jaw jumped. He looked at that shelf the way a general looks at an enemy fortress. "Who is it?" "I have no idea," Peggy said honestly. "That's what makes it so charming. It's a mystery." "Charming," he repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Someone is trespassing on royal grounds, reaching the sovereign's private chambers and making illicit advances toward the alpha's mate. And you find it charming." "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds even better," she chirped. He made a strangled noise in the back of his throat. She knew she was poking the bear, but his reaction was just so much. For years, before the bonding, Peggy had perfected the art of being invisible. She'd been the quiet Omega healer, the one people looked through, not at. To be the subject of not one, but 2 simultaneous, competing courtships was a novelty she intended to savor, even if one of the suitors was her own mate, and the other was a phantom who was going to get himself thrown in the dungeon if Callum ever caught him. His wolf was practically clawing at the inside of his skull, a frantic, bellowing monologue of outrage that bled through their bond. It wasn't in words, not like her own wolf's crisp reports, but in waves of pure primal emotion. Mine. Mate is mine. Shelf is insult. Flower is treason. Burn the forests. Burn them all. No more flowers. I've doubled the guards, Callum said, his voice dangerously low. He began to pace, a caged lion in his own den. I have trackers sweeping the perimeter every hour. I've personally interrogated every member of the kitchen staff who starts before dawn. Nothing. No foreign tracks, no unfamiliar scent. Nobody has seen a thing. Peggy bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. She could just imagine the scene. King Callum, a man who commanded armies, looming over a terrified baker. Did you see anyone with a jaunty little rock, Philippe? Are you hiding a pebble-pushing miscreant? This isn't funny, Peggy. It's a little bit funny, she corrected gently. Look at this. She gestured to the two collections. My own personal courtship war. On one side, a mystery man of simple, elegant taste. On the other, the king of everything, trying to solve a romantic gesture with brute force and a state-level investigation. He stopped pacing and pinned her with a look. For a moment, the frantic jealousy receded, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability that always caught her off guard. He is courting you, he said, his voice rough. He is trying to win my mate. The unspoken fear hung in the air between them. What if he succeeds? Her heart softened. Oh, this ridiculous, wonderful, insecure man. She crossed the room and stood before him, reaching up to smooth the furrow between his brows. Callum, no one is winning me. You already won. She leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to his lips. But, she added, pulling back with a mischievous glint in her eyes, a little competition never hurt anyone. It's making you very creative. She glanced pointedly at the ridiculously opulent shawl. His wolf howled in frustration, a blast of pure, unadulterated possessiveness. She is making light of the sacred bond. The intruder must be found and reduced to his constituent atoms. Shut up, Callum breathed, pressing his fingers to his temple. I didn't say anything, Finian said. Not you. Callum turned back to his beta, his eyes narrowed with a new, terrible idea. The delegation. Stonemaw Ridge. They arrive within the hour. Finian nodded slowly. Baron von Hess. A man so slick he probably slides instead of walks. What about him? Their territory is known for its strange herbs, its scent-blocking poultices, Callum mused, the theory taking shape, a beautiful, perfect vessel for all his free-floating rage. The Baron is unmarried. He's known for his poetic flatteries. He met Peggy at the coronation last year. He was staring. Finian sighed, a sound of biblical exhaustion. Everyone was staring, Callum. She was being officially presented as the Alpha's mate. It's protocol. It's called the sniff of general approval for the goddess's sake. A tradition I, for one, would like to see abolished. Callum's memory of that day was a red haze. He remembered the line of elders and visiting dignitaries, all waiting their turn to formally welcome Peggy to the pack with a polite, scent-based greeting. And he remembered his wolf, Sovereign, standing just behind his ribs, vibrating with the urge to dismember every single male who came within 5 feet of her. He had, to his eternal shame, let a low growl slip when old Lord Hemlock had lingered a moment too long. Hemlock had been half-deaf and was probably just trying to remember where he'd left his spectacles, but the damage was done. The diplomatic incident had taken Finian a week to smooth over. Von Hess wasn't staring, Callum insisted, pointing an accusatory finger at his beta. He was plotting with his eyes. Plotting with his eyes. Right. Finian picked up a fresh sheaf of parchments. Well, you can test your eye-plotting theory on him shortly. His party was sighted at the Northern Pass. They'll be here for the evening meal. He paused. Try to be a gracious host, Callum. That means no baseless accusations, no scent-checking the Baron's pockets for suspicious pebbles, and under no circumstances are you to challenge him to a duel over a potential flower-related transgression. A duel! A splendid idea, Sovereign roared with approval. Let us defend our mate's honor upon the field of battle. We shall smite this Von Hesse, this purveyor of purple provocations. A duel is a bit much, Callum conceded, mostly to his wolf. But I'm going to watch him, Finn. I'm going to watch his every move. Finian just shook his head, already anticipating the diplomatic nightmare to come. Just try not to set anyone on fire, my king. It makes for such tiresome paperwork. The arrival of Baron von Hesse was exactly as irritating as Peggy had anticipated. He was a tall, severe-looking man with silvering hair and eyes the color of a frozen lake. He moved with a liquid grace that felt studied, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. He bowed over Peggy's hand, his lips lingering a fraction of a second too long against her knuckles. "Your Majesty," he murmured, his voice a low, cultured purr. "You are even more radiant than I remembered." Beside her, Callum went rigid. The air temperature dropped by 10 degrees. Peggy could feel the raw, possessive energy pouring off her mate in waves. It was a miracle the tapestries on the wall didn't start to smoke. "His scent is of ambition and stale perfume," Silence noted clinically in her head. "He is a container of empty compliments. Also, our mate is about to vibrate through the floorboards." "Baron," Peggy said, retrieving her hand with a polite but firm tug. "Welcome to Blackwood. We trust your journey was pleasant." "As pleasant as any journey that ends in such delightful company can be," he replied, his gaze sweeping over her in a way that was meant to be appreciative, but felt more like an appraisal. Callum stepped forward, subtly positioning himself between Peggy and the Baron. It was a classic alpha move, a piece of non-verbal communication that screamed "mine" in a way that transcended species. "Baron, good of you to finally arrive. My beta has your quarters prepared." The dismissal was clear. Von Hesse's thin lips tightened for a barest moment before his smooth mask slipped back into place. "Of course, Your Majesty. I look forward to our discussions this evening." He gave Peggy one last, lingering look before turning to follow a waiting attendant. The moment he was out of earshot, Callum turned to her, his eyes blazing. "He's the one. He's the one who's going to be the victim of a diplomatic incident if you don't learn to breathe," Peggy countered, keeping her voice low. "Callum, he's just a flatterer. It's what men like him do." "He was mentally undressing you, Peggy. He was mentally assessing our pack's political stability by observing the Queen's demeanor. There's a difference." She took his arm, her touch a calming anchor in the storm of his jealousy. "Come on, let's walk in the garden before dinner. You need to commune with some non-sentient plant life for a few minutes." He let her lead him out into the crisp evening air, but his agitation didn't lessen. He kept glancing back towards the castle, as if expecting the Baron to rappel down the wall with a bouquet of incriminating wildflowers at any moment. As they strolled down a familiar path lined with moonbloom and silver moss, Peggy's mind drifted back to the gifts, to the pattern. Flower, stone, feather, bark. She stopped, her eyes falling on a patch of late-blooming bellflowers at the base of an old oak. The exact same shade of dusky purple as the one from this morning. "Item 1, Silence stated. "Proximity confirmed." Peggy's heart gave a little thump. She walked a few more steps, her gaze scanning the path. There, nestled amongst the moss, was a small, flat stone with a white line through it. Just like the one from yesterday. Her breath hitched. She looked further down the path. A magpie, perched on a low-hanging branch, preened its feathers. A few feet beyond it, the peeling bark of a birch tree shone pale in the fading light. Flower, stone, feather, bark. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a map. It was this exact path. The path they had walked on their very first day together. The day he had shown her the heart of his territory. The day his wolf had recognized hers, and the world had tilted on its axis. She remembered noticing each of those things, pointing them out to him. The unique color of the flower, the perfect line on the stone. She'd thought he was only half listening, his attention divided by the responsibilities of a king. But someone had been listening. Someone had remembered every single trivial thing she'd found beautiful. And there was only one person who had been on that walk with her. She felt a slow, dizzying sense of understanding dawn in her mind. The impossible access to the window? Impossible for anyone who wasn't already inside the castle. The absence of any unfamiliar scent, because there was no unfamiliar scent. The guards who saw nothing suspicious, because the king's wolf on the castle grounds at night was not suspicious. It wasn't a rival. It wasn't a ghost or a fae or a lovesick stonemason. It was so much simpler and so much more complicated than that. She turned to look at her mate. He was still scowling in the direction of the guest wing, his mind consumed with a phantom enemy. He was the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. He was a brilliant strategist and a fearsome warrior. And he was, at this moment, a complete and utter idiot. The suspect has been in plain sight all along, Silence observed, with what might have been the faintest trace of amusement. The level of dramatic irony is becoming exquisite. Peggy took a deep breath, a laugh bubbling up in her chest. A wild, incredulous, joyful laugh. Callum turned to her, startled out of his brooding. "What is it? What's so funny?" She looked at him, at this wonderful, ferocious, clueless man, and her heart felt so full it might burst. "Oh, you beautiful fool," she said, her voice shaking with mirth. "I know who's been leaving the gifts." Callum stared at her, the blood draining from his face. The moment he had been dreading for 3 weeks had finally arrived. She knew. And she was laughing. Laughing! This was not the reaction of a woman whose mate's honor had been preserved. This was the reaction of a woman who was charmed, delighted, and utterly won over by his rival. He felt a cold dread snake its way through his gut. It was over. He had lost a war he didn't even know how to fight. "We are defeated!" Sovereign wailed, a chorus of operatic despair. "Our treasures were trinkets. Our silks were dust. The Rockbringer has claimed her heart with the currency of the earth itself. We are undone. Undone." "Who?" he managed to choke out, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Just tell me who it is, Peggy. I won't kill him. Probably." Peggy's laughter subsided into a wide, brilliant smile that lit up her whole face. It was the kind of smile he hadn't seen directed at him in weeks, and it made his heart ache with a fresh wave of jealousy. She reached out and took both of his hands, her eyes sparkling. "It's you," she said, her voice soft and full of wonder. He blinked. The world stopped spinning, the birds stopped singing, his wolf's internal aria came to a screeching halt. "What?" "It's you," she repeated, squeezing his hands. "Well, not exactly you, but also entirely you." He had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. "Peggy, I appreciate you trying to spare my feelings, but I can assure you, I have not been scaling my own castle walls in the dead of night to leave myself anonymous gifts. My schedule is quite full as it is." "Not you, she clarified, her smile widening. "Your wolf. The runs, Callum. The ones you can't remember. The ones you wake up aching from." The ground dropped out from under him. The thought he had been refusing to look at, the one that had been sitting in the dark corner of his mind for days, patient and still, stepped into the light. The aching muscles, the dirt under his nails, the dreams that weren't dreams. Finian's careful, pointed comment about someone whose scent was already part of the stone. The guards who saw the king's wolf running at night and thought nothing of it, because why would they? He was their alpha, the grounds were his. And his wolf, who had been raging about the intruder with operatic fury while offering exactly 0 useful tactical information, had been performing. The outrage, the jealousy, the calls to burn the forests, it was all a smokescreen. Not to deceive him exactly. His wolf couldn't deceive him any more than his left hand could lie to his right. But Callum had been so desperate to not see the truth that he'd let the performance be the only thing he looked at. He hadn't been tricked. He'd been in denial. He reached for the part of his mind where his wolf resided, a place of instinct and poetry and raw emotion. He pushed past the usual bluster and outrage and demanded a straight answer. "You knew." "I knew. I just didn't want to see it." Sovereign's reply was not a word, but a feeling, a radiant, defiant, and completely unrepentant sense of pride. And beneath it, something quieter. Patience. He had been waiting, not hiding, waiting for Callum to stop being afraid of his own tenderness. Then the wolf showed him why. A memory surfaced, not new, but finally unburied. 3 weeks and 4 days ago. A Tuesday evening, nothing special. They had been sitting by the fire, both reading, comfortable in each other's silence the way long-bonded mates are. Peggy had looked up from her book and said, lightly, with a small smile, "I walked past the old oak today. The purple bellflowers are blooming again. Do you remember? From our first walk?" "You probably don't. You had 1,000 things on your mind that day." She hadn't been sad. She hadn't been asking for anything. It was just a small, offered memory, the kind of thing you share with someone because you love them, and the memory makes you happy, and you want them to be in it with you for a moment. And Callum had looked up from his dispatch and said, warmly, genuinely, "Of course I remember the walk." He'd smiled at her, she'd smiled back, and that had been the end of it. But the wolf had caught what the king had missed. He remembered the walk. He did not remember the bellflowers. He did not remember the stone with the white line, or the magpie feather, or the curl of birch bark she'd pointed out with quiet delight. He remembered the day. He had forgotten her in it. Not out of cruelty, out of the simple, ordinary way that a busy man lets the small, sacred details slip through his fingers, because there is always another dispatch, another crisis, another thing that feels more urgent than the color of a flower his mate once loved. The wolf had felt the difference between what she offered and what he returned. Not a wound, just a gap. A place where something should have been and wasn't. And that night, for the first time, the wolf had run. So we did what was needed. The feeling communicated. She remembered everything. You remembered nothing. So we went back and collected what you had dropped. You are welcome. Another image followed, his wolf's perspective. A view of Peggy's sleeping face, seen through the glass of her window, her features softened by moonlight. A large, gray-furred paw carefully placing a river stone on the ledge. Not stealth, not secrecy. Just a quiet, devoted ritual that the waking part of him had been too proud to claim. "I didn't want to know," he said to Peggy, his voice faint. He felt like an absolute world-class imbecile. "I think some part of me knew. The aching, the dreams. Finn practically spelled it out for me this morning. You just couldn't admit that your wolf is more romantic than you are," Peggy finished, her amusement tempered with a wave of deep affection. She reached up and cupped his cheek. "We are the same person," he protested weakly, the words tasting like a lie even as he said them. She just smiled, a small, knowing smile that said everything. "And yet," she said. He stared at her, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Humiliation, relief, awe, and a strange, grudging respect for the part of him that had simply done what needed doing, while his conscious mind was busy being an idiot. He had been buying her things. His wolf had been giving her memories. And as he looked at the adoration in her eyes, he had no doubt about which one had truly mattered. "See," Sovereign purred, smugness rolling off him in waves. "Poetry, not purchase. I shall compose an epic in your honor. It will be titled, 'The King Who Did Not Recognize His Own Heart's Handiwork.' It will have 12 cantos." "Please don't," Callum muttered under his breath. He had a diplomatic dinner to attend, a tiresome baron to endure, and a very, very long reckoning with his own willful blindness. And he had to do it all while pretending he hadn't just discovered he'd been running a state-level investigation into himself. Tonight was going to be a nightmare. The diplomatic dinner was, in a word, excruciating. Callum sat at the head of the great table, a polite, kingly smile plastered on his face while a civil war raged in his head. Every time he looked at Peggy, seated to his right, he was reminded of his own monumental foolishness. She would catch his eye and give him a tiny, secret smile, and he would feel a fresh wave of heat creep up his neck. Baron von Hesse, seated to her other side, seemed to take her good mood as a personal invitation. "Your Majesty seems particularly joyful this evening," the Baron purred, leaning toward Peggy with an oily familiarity that made Callum's teeth ache. "The air of Blackwood must agree with you." "The air is full of surprises," Peggy replied, her eyes twinkling as she glanced at Callum. Callum took a large gulp of wine, wishing it were poison, preferably for the Baron. "He attempts to ensnare her with his word snares," Sovereign fumed. "The fool. Her heart is a fortress, and I have already tunneled beneath the walls with the spade of sincere remembrance. Tell him his flattery is as the buzzing of a fly against the roar of our devotion." "I will do no such thing," Callum shot back internally. "You will be quiet. You have done enough. You spent 3 weeks making me compete with myself." "I spent 3 weeks being the only half of us willing to do the work," Sovereign countered, deeply offended. "She looks upon you now with the light of 1,000 dawns in her eyes, a light I put there, with a rock." "Is something amiss, Your Majesty?" von Hesse asked, his cold eyes fixed on Callum. "You seem distracted." Callum forced his smile to remain in place. "Just contemplating the complexities of our upcoming trade negotiations, Baron. They require a certain focus." "Indeed." The Baron took a delicate sip of his own wine. "Focus is paramount. A kingdom cannot be governed by a mind divided. It creates vulnerabilities." The words were silk, but the undertone was steel. It was a probe, a test. Peggy's smile faded slightly. She shifted in her seat, her posture becoming more alert. She had heard it too. This wasn't idle chatter. The meal dragged on. Callum did his best to engage in the stilted conversation, discussing lumber tariffs and border patrols, while his wolf provided a running, deeply unhelpful commentary. "This Baron's wolf is a shriveled thing, a raisin of a wolf," Sovereign declared. "It dreams only of ledgers and loopholes. It has no poetry, no passion. It has probably never even considered the romantic potential of a well-chosen piece of bark." Callum was beginning to suspect that his wolf's obsession with gift-giving was a symptom of a much larger problem. He was so focused on his internal argument that he almost missed the Baron's next move. "And so, with the recent instability along the Whisperwood border," von Hesse was saying to one of the council elders, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the whole table, "one must question if the old treaties still serve our best interests. A strong hand is needed, a steady hand. One not preoccupied with domestic matters." The barb was aimed directly at Callum, and it hit its mark. The table went quiet. Everyone was looking at him. They had all noticed his distraction, his obsessive hunt for the gift-giver. They'd seen him short-tempered and agitated for weeks. Von Hesse was using it, painting him as a weak, love-struck fool who was neglecting his kingdom. And the worst part was, the Baron wasn't entirely wrong. He had been neglectful. He'd let his pride and jealousy consume him. He felt a surge of cold fury, directed at the Baron, at himself, and yes, even at the smugly silent wolf in his head. He opened his mouth to deliver a scathing retort, to put the arrogant Baron in his place. But Peggy spoke first. Her voice was calm and clear, cutting through the tension in the room. "A ruler's strength isn't measured by what he ignores, Baron," she said, her gaze level and firm. "It's measured by what he values enough to protect, be it a border, a treaty, or his own home." It was a masterful deflection, turning the Baron's insult into a statement on Callum's devotion. Von Hesse looked momentarily thrown, his attack neutralized. A low murmur of approval went around the table from Callum's council members. Callum looked at his mate, truly looked at her. She wasn't just defending him, she was governing, right here at his side. She was his queen. And for the past 3 weeks, he had treated her like a prize to be won, a territory to be defended, instead of the partner she was. The humiliation he'd felt before curdled into a deeper, sharper shame. He had been so busy competing with a phantom, with himself, he'd failed to see the real treasure was the woman who sat beside him, fighting his battles with a grace and intelligence he had been too blind to properly appreciate. The dinner couldn't end soon enough. He needed to talk to her. He needed to fix the mess he had made, not just with the Baron, but with her. Later, in the quiet of their chambers, the tension from the dinner party lingered. The grand, opulent gifts on the dressing table seemed to mock him. The simple, heartfelt offerings on the windowsill felt like an accusation. Peggy was silent, brushing her hair with slow, measured strokes, her back to him. The easy warmth that had been between them in the garden was gone, replaced by a cool reserve. "He's planning something," Callum said, breaking the silence. "Von Hess. He was testing me tonight, looking for weakness." "And he found it," Peggy said, her voice quiet, without inflection. She didn't turn around. The words stung. "I was distracted," he admitted. "This whole situation with the gifts." "Yes," she said, "the situation." He could feel a wall going up between them, brick by mortifying brick. He didn't know how to breach it. He was a king. He commanded armies. He negotiated treaties. But he had no idea how to navigate the territory of his own mate's disappointment. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He blundered forward. "I made a fool of myself," he said, his voice rough with frustration. "For weeks, hunting a ghost. My own ghost." He gestured vaguely at the window. "And you knew. You were laughing at me." She finally stopped brushing her hair and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable. "I wasn't laughing at you, Callum. I was laughing with joy, because I thought it was the most romantic thing I had ever heard of. That some deep instinctual part of you remembered those little things and felt the need to show me." "It wasn't." He stopped. The old protest, "It wasn't me, it was him," died on his tongue. Because she was right, and Finian had been right, and his wolf had been patiently, silently right for 3 weeks. It was him. All of it. The nightly runs, the careful selections, the climb to the window, his body, his memories, his love. He'd just been too afraid to own it while awake. "I couldn't see it," he said instead, his voice rough. "That the best part of my courtship was the part I was doing unconsciously. What does that say about me, Peggy? That I have to be asleep to be honest?" The question hung in the air, raw and genuine. She hadn't expected him to go there. But his vulnerability was short-lived, because all his shame, his embarrassment, his feelings of inadequacy coalesced into a hot, defensive anger. "And you preferred it, didn't you?" he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "You liked the game. You enjoyed watching me tear the castle apart, watching me make a fool of myself over you. Is the king not enough for you? Do you need these little games to feel wanted?" The moment the words left his mouth, he wished he could claw them back. He saw the hurt flash in her eyes, sharp and deep. He had struck her core wound, the fear of being invisible, of being valued for her role and not for herself. He hadn't just insulted her, he'd implied that her affection was something that had to be bought with drama and grand gestures. Her face went pale, the light in her eyes extinguished, leaving behind a cool, guarded emptiness. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply withdrew. It was 1,000 times worse than if she had screamed at him. "I see," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "Forgive me for finding joy in being seen. I'll try to be a less demanding queen in the future." She walked past him, her scent a faint trail of sorrow and crushed lavender, and went into the adjoining dressing room, closing the door softly behind her. The click of the latch was the loudest sound he had ever heard. He stood alone in the center of the room, the silence pressing in on him. The bond between them, usually a warm, vibrant hum beneath his skin, felt thin and cold, like a frayed string, and the shift was pushing at him, hard now, his bones aching with the need to be something simpler, something that ran instead of talked. He gripped the edge of the dressing table until his knuckles went white, holding his human shape through sheer, stubborn will, because he did not deserve the relief of 4 legs and an empty mind right now. "You have blundered, human," Sovereign said, his usual dramatic flair gone, replaced by a quiet, mournful tone. "You have taken a gift and called it a weapon. You have taken her joy and called it a game. We offered her memories of beauty. You have offered her a memory of pain." Callum sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He had been so consumed with his own pride, his own ridiculous jealousy, that he had broken the one thing he had sworn to protect. He had won his mate, and in one stupid, angry outburst, he had pushed her further away than any rival ever could. The wildflowers on the windowsill seemed to wilt before his eyes. Peggy sat in the dark dressing room, her hands clenched in her lap. She was not going to cry. Crying was a luxury, an indulgence, and she was the queen now. Queens did not indulge, they endured. Her wolf, Silence, was a cool, steady presence in the back of her mind, a block of ice against the burning hurt in her chest. His words were a product of wounded pride, Silence stated. An emotional projectile launched from a place of insecurity. The tactical assessment is that he is an idiot, a magnificent, powerful, world-altering idiot. Peggy took a shaky breath. "He thinks I was playing with him." "He thinks he is not enough," Silence corrected. It is a common affliction among alphas. Their egos are vast and exquisitely fragile structures, like a palace made of spun sugar. The logical assessment helped, but it didn't soothe the ache. All her life she had been Peggy, the quiet healer. Useful, but overlooked. People's eyes slid past her. When Callum had chosen her, it had been like stepping into the sun for the first time. But a small, cold part of her had always wondered if he saw her, or if he saw the mate fate had assigned him, the Omega who would complete his Alpha. The gifts from his wolf, they had quieted that fear. They were proof that somewhere inside him the memory of her, of the small things she loved, was cherished. They were not for the queen. They were for Peggy. And Callum had just thrown that back in her face, twisting it into a criticism of her character. She stayed there for a long time, listening to the silence from the other room. Then the silence changed. She heard the creak of the balcony door, and through the thin wall came a sound she hadn't heard from Callum in weeks, the low, grinding shift of bone and muscle rearranging itself. Not the violent crack of a forced change, but the slow, surrendering exhale of someone finally letting go of a shape they couldn't hold anymore. A pause, then the soft click of claws on stone, and nothing. He shifted, Silence observed. Finally. Peggy pressed her hand flat against the wall, as if she could feel the residual warmth of him through the stone. He was gone, running. Somewhere out in the dark, her mate was finally letting himself be the simpler thing. She almost envied him. Almost. "Run," Silence suggested, with uncharacteristic gentleness. "You need it too." She did. The shift came fast, almost grateful, her wolf rising up not as a separate force, but as the truest, least complicated part of herself. One moment she was a woman sitting in a dark room with her hands in her lap. The next she was smaller, lower, and the world was a cathedral of scent and sound. The hurt was still there, but it was different in this form. Less a sharp thing in her chest and more a low, distant ache, like a bruise she could move around. She nosed open the dressing room door, crossed the empty chamber, and slipped out onto the balcony. The night air hit her like cold water, and she ran. Not toward Callum, not away from him, just out, into the dark and the trees and the clean, uncomplicated language of 4 legs and open ground. She ran until the ache loosened, until the knot in her chest became something she could carry without it cutting. Then she stopped, panting, at the edge of the tree line and looked up at the castle. The archives. She needed the archives. She shifted back in the shadow of the stable wall, shivering in the cold, and pulled a spare cloak from the hook that every wolf in the castle knew was there for exactly this reason. Her fingers were still trembling. Her mind was not. "The Baron is leveraging your bond as a political weakness," Silence analyzed, crisp and clear now. "The logical countermove is to demonstrate it is, in fact, the pack's greatest strength." Peggy straightened the cloak, her resolve hardening. She would deal with her own hurt later. Right now, her pack and her mate were under threat. She was not just a healer anymore. She had a wolf of her own, a mind for detail, and access to the royal archives. Von Hesse thought he was playing against a distracted Alpha King. He was about to find out he was also playing against a deeply underestimated queen. She went to the archives. She had work to do. When she returned to their chambers hours later, the main room was empty. But on the small table beside her bed, a single object sat where there had been nothing before. It was a piece of parchment, weighted down by one of the smooth river stones from the windowsill. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. It wasn't a letter, it was a drawing. A detailed, surprisingly skillful sketch of a dusky purple bellflower. And underneath it, in Callum's messy, forceful script, were 3 words. "I am sorry." It wasn't enough to fix what he had broken, but it was a start. It was an acknowledgement. He wasn't just the king. He was the man who had, in the middle of his own pain, sat down and tried to replicate the simple gift his wolf had given her. He was trying to speak the same language. Awake this time. On purpose. The next day, the council meeting was thick with attention that had nothing to do with lumber tariffs. Baron von Hesse sat across the great oak table from Callum, his face a mask of polite concern that didn't fool anyone. He had spent the morning sowing quiet seeds of doubt among the council members, murmuring about the king's preoccupation and the need for clear-headed leadership. Callum, for his part, looked like he hadn't slept. There were dark circles under his eyes, but the frantic, jealous energy of the past few weeks was gone. In its place was a quiet, grim focus. He had spent the night running, properly running, for the first time in weeks. His wolf's paws eating up miles of dark forest while his human mind finally, painfully, caught up with everything he'd been refusing to see. The run hadn't fixed anything, but it had burned away the noise, leaving only the clean, hard truth. He had hurt his mate. His pack was under threat, and he needed to be better. Starting now. "Baron," Callum began, his voice steady, "we have reviewed your proposal regarding the Stonewall Blackwood Treaty. Your request to renegotiate the border checkpoints is extensive." "A matter of security, Your Majesty," von Hesse said smoothly. "Given the recent troubles, a more robust presence is required. My people feel vulnerable." "Vulnerable," Callum repeated, his gaze flat. "And these new checkpoints you propose, they would, coincidentally, give your patrols access to the Silver Stream River, a territory that has been under Blackwood protection for 200 years. "A necessary concession for the greater good," the Baron replied without blinking. It was a power grab, pure and simple. He was using the phantom border troubles he'd likely instigated himself as a pretext to seize control of a valuable resource, betting that Callum was too distracted by his domestic drama to put up a fight. "The treaty is clear," one of Callum's elders grumbled. "The Silver Stream is ours." "Treaties, Lord Marius, are living documents," von Hesse countered. "They must adapt to changing circumstances. And circumstances have, you must admit, changed. Leadership requires unwavering attention." He let his gaze drift pointedly towards the empty seat beside Callum, the Queen's seat. Her absence was a statement, and the Baron was using it as a weapon. Right on cue, the doors to the council chamber opened. Peggy entered. She was not dressed in the soft silks of a queen, but in a simple, practical leather tunic and breeches. She looked less like a consort and more like a strategist. She carried a heavy, leather-bound ledger in her arms. She walked to her seat beside Callum, her expression calm and unreadable. She gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod, then turned her cool gaze on Baron von Hesse. "My apologies for my tardiness, gentlemen," she said, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "I was consulting the archives. It makes for such clarifying reading." She placed the ledger on the table with a solid thud. "Baron, you speak of your people's vulnerability. I was just reading the original transcripts from the treaty negotiations of my mate's grandfather. Your own grandfather, Baron, spoke at length about the importance of the Silver Stream as a neutral zone, a promise of peace between our pacts. He called it a sacred trust." Von Hesse's smile tightened. "Ancient history, Your Majesty." "Is it?" Peggy opened the ledger. "Because I also have the trade manifests from the last 6 months. It seems a large number of agricultural tools have been shipped to your forward garrisons. Tools that bear a remarkable resemblance to crossbows and pikes. It seems you have been preparing for this vulnerability for quite some time." The council chamber erupted in murmurs. Von Hesse's face had gone pale. He had underestimated her. He had seen a pretty soft Omega, a domestic distraction. He had not seen a queen with a mind like a steel trap and the will to use it. Peggy wasn't finished. She looked not at the Baron, but at the council, at their people. "A leader's focus is not a weakness, Baron. My mate's focus on his home, on his bond, is the source of his strength. It is the heart of this pack. Some promises," she said, her eyes finding Callum's, "are grand and jeweled, displayed for all to see. Others are simple and quiet, and kept every single day, even when no one is watching. Our king understands the difference. Do you?" The message was clear. She was talking about more than just treaties. She was talking about them. She was declaring her faith, not just in him as a ruler, but in him as a man, in front of everyone. It was the moment everything shifted. The doubt in the room evaporated, replaced by a surge of loyalty. Von Hesse was exposed, his manipulations laid bare. He was a man who dealt in loopholes and lies, trying to challenge a king and queen who dealt in sacred trusts. Callum felt a wave of profound, humbling gratitude wash over him. She had not only saved his treaty, she had saved him from himself. He had been so lost in his own pride, and she had calmly, competently reminded him, and everyone else, what truly mattered. He stood up, his chair scraping against the stone floor. The room fell silent. He didn't look at Von Hesse. He only looked at Peggy. He walked around the table and stopped in front of her. He took her hand, his touch gentle. In front of his entire council, he bowed his head. "You saw the truth when I was blind," he said, his voice thick with emotion, but clear for all to hear. "Thank you, my queen." Sovereign was silent in his mind, but it was a silence filled with a deep, resonant awe. It was a silence of perfect contentment. This, the wolf seemed to say, was a bond. Not the grand gestures or the poetic declarations, but this, a partnership, a quiet, unshakable strength forged in truth. Baron von Hesse knew he was defeated. He stood abruptly. "It seems I have misread the situation," he said stiffly. "My proposal is withdrawn." He turned and left the chamber without another word, his ambition turning to ash in his wake. Callum didn't watch him go. He was still looking at Peggy, his heart in his eyes. The apology he had sketched on parchment was nothing compared to this. This public act of humility, this acknowledgement of her strength, was the real beginning of making things right. That night, the chambers were quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was soft and peaceful, filled with unspoken understanding. The grand gifts on the dressing table had been put away. The simple treasures on the windowsill remained, catching the moonlight. Callum sat on the edge of the bed, watching Peggy as she stood by the window, her fingers tracing the edge of the white-lined stone. He had spent the afternoon dealing with the fallout of the Baron's departure, solidifying his counsel, and sending a clear message to Stonemaw Ridge. But his mind had been here, with her. "What you did today," he began, his voice rough. "Peggy, She turned to face him, a small, sad smile on her lips. "I did what was necessary for the pack." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You did more than that. You showed me what I had been refusing to see." He stood and walked to her, stopping a few feet away, giving her space. He felt as though he were standing on hollow ground. "I owe you more than an apology." He took a deep breath. This was the hard part. Not the fighting, not the ruling, but this. The quiet, terrifying act of being vulnerable. "The reason I reacted the way I did," he said, forcing himself to meet her eyes, "is because I was afraid. When I saw those gifts, and I saw how much they meant to you, I was terrified that what I could offer wasn't enough. That the king, the alpha, all the power and wealth, that none of it measured up to a single, perfect wildflower. I was afraid that you would see that I am not the mate you deserve." He paused, his throat working. "And then to find out that the part of me that knew how to love you properly was the part I had to be unconscious to access, that was worse. Because it meant I was right. The best version of me was the one that didn't need my permission to show up." There it was, the truth of his wound, deeper than he'd meant to go. The deep-seated fear of inadequacy that he papered over with arrogance and authority, and the newer, sharper fear that his wolf was the man Peggy deserved, and the king was just the obstacle standing in the way. Peggy's expression softened, the last of her hurt melting away, replaced by a profound, aching empathy. She closed the distance between them and finally, took his hand. "Oh, Callum," she whispered. "My wound is that I've spent my life feeling invisible, that people looked right through me. And your wound is that you're terrified you aren't worth seeing." It was a perfect mirror, two sides of the same lonely coin. He hid behind power, she hid behind quietness, but both of them were just afraid of not being enough. "When I saw those gifts," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "it wasn't about a rival. It was the first time in my life I felt like someone had truly seen me. Not the queen, not the alpha's mate. Just Peggy, the woman who likes the funny line on a rock and the dusky color of a flower. Your wolf, you saw me. And I loved you for it." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Even when you're a jealous, overbearing, magnificent fool." He let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "He's better at this than I am," he admitted, a wry, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "The romance." "No," she said, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "He's just the part of you that isn't afraid to remember the little things. He doesn't have a crown to worry about. He only has a mate to love. But Callum, he is you. That tenderness is yours. You just have to stop being afraid of it." He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. The cold, frayed cord of their bond ignited with warmth, weaving itself back together, stronger and thicker than before. "I want to be better," he whispered. "I want to be the man my own wolf already knows I am." "Then stop getting out of your own way," she murmured, and her lips found his. The kiss was not frantic or possessive. It was a quiet promise, a treaty of their own, signed in the moonlight. Later, as they lay tangled together in bed, the castle silent around them, Sovereign purred in the back of Callum's mind, a sound of deep, rumbling satisfaction. And for the first time, Callum's own heart purred back in perfect harmony. A week later, Peggy woke to the familiar sliver of dawn light creeping into the room. She smiled, stretching, and turned to look at the windowsill. For the past 6 mornings, it had been empty. She understood. The game was over. The mystery was solved. She felt a small, wistful pang of loss for the morning surprises, but it was overshadowed by the new, solid peace between her and Callum. But this morning, something was there. It wasn't a wildflower or a stone. It was a single, perfect maple leaf, turned a brilliant shade of fiery red. It was placed carefully in the center of the ledge. There was no mistaking its origin. This wasn't a memory of a past walk. This was new. This was a discovery from yesterday's ride through the northern woods, a leaf she had admired as they passed through a stand of old maples turning color. She heard a soft sound from the bed and turned. Callum was awake, propped up on one elbow, watching her. His hair was still damp, and there was a faint smudge of dirt on his forearm, the telltale residue of a run. But his eyes were warm and fully present, and there was a quiet, hopeful light in them that she had never seen before. Not his wolf's devoted patience, not the king's polished confidence, just Callum, awake and undefended, watching to see if she understood. "I went out this morning," he said softly, "ran the northern ridge, found it on the way back." A pause. "I was awake the whole time." Peggy picked up the leaf, its edges crisp, its color vibrant. She brought it back to the bed and sat beside him, her heart so full it felt like a tangible thing in her chest. She leaned over and kissed him, a long, sweet kiss that tasted of new beginnings. "It's beautiful," she whispered against his lips. He smiled then, a real, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "I have to admit," he said, his voice a low rumble, he was right. The rocks are better. On the windowsill, the collection continued to grow. A hawk's feather was joined by a shard of blue glass, worn smooth by the river. A curl of birch bark sat beside a funny, twisted twig that looked like a question mark. The shelf held 2 stories now, woven into one. The story of a wolf's unwavering memory, and the story of a king who was learning to see.